Hello everyone. Thank you so much for your likes, your subscriptions, and your thoughtful comments. Your support means a great deal and truly helps the channel grow. I'm very grateful to have you here.
Chapter 8. Polish liberty may be considered as the source of Polish wretchedness, and Poland appears to me, as far as I can judge by the specimens which fell under my observation, of all countries, the most distressed. Nor indeed do the natives themselves attempt to palliate or deny this melancholy fact. Upon expressing my surprise at one instance of the abuse of liberty, to which I had been myself a witness, to a person well versed in the laws of the country, he returned for answer, "If you knew the confusion and anarchy of our constitution, you would be surprised at nothing. Many grievances necessarily exist even in the best regulated states. What then must be the case in ours? Which of all governments is the most detestable?" Another, lamenting the dreadful situation of his country, said to me, "The name of Poland still remains, but the nation no longer exists. A universal corruption and venality pervades all ranks of people. Many of the first nobility do not blush to receive pensions from foreign courts. One professes himself publicly an Austrian, a second a Prussian, a third a Frenchman, and a fourth a Russian. The present situation of the Polish nation impressed my mind with the most pathetic ideas of fallen greatness, and I could not consider, without a mixture of regret and sympathy, a people who formerly gave law to the north, reduced to so low a state of insignificance and domestic misery. The nation has few manufactures, scarcely any commerce, a king almost without authority, the nobles in a state of uncontrolled anarchy, the peasants groaning under a yoke of feudal despotism far worse than the tyranny of an absolute monarch. I never before observed such an inequality of fortune, such sudden transition from extreme riches to extreme poverty. Wherever I turned my eyes, luxury and wretchedness were constant neighbors. In a word, the boasted Polish liberty is not enjoyed in the smallest degree by the bulk of the people, but is confined among the nobles or gentry. The truth of these remarks will appear from the following account of the inhabitants. The inhabitants of Poland are nobles, clergy, citizens, and peasants. The nobles are divided into two classes, the members of the Senate and of the equestrian order. Having, upon a former occasion, described the powers which senators enjoy in their collective capacity, it will be unnecessary to repeat them in this place. We should be greatly deceived if we were to understand the word noble in our sense of that term. In the laws of Poland, a noble is a person who possesses a freehold estate, or who can prove his descent from ancestors formerly possessing a freehold, following no trade or commerce, and at liberty to choose the place of his habitation. This description includes all persons above burghers and peasants. The members of this body below the rank of senators are called, in a collective state, the equestrian order, and in their individual capacities nobles, gentlemen, freemen, or landholders, which appellations are synonymous. All the nobles or gentry are in the strict letter of the law equal by birth, so that all honors and titles are supposed to add nothing to their real dignity. By means of their representatives in the Diet, they have a share in the legislative authority, and in some cases, as in the election of a king, they assemble in person. When each noble is capable of being elected a nuncio, of bearing the office of a senator, and of presenting himself as a candidate upon a vacancy in the throne, no noble can be arrested without being previously convicted, except in cases of high treason, murder and robbery on the highway, and then he must be surprised in the fact. The definition of a noble being thus applied not only to persons actually possessing land, but even to the descendants of former landholders, comprehends such a large body of men that many of them are in a state of extreme indigence, and as, according to the Polish law, they lose their nobility if they follow trade or commerce, the most needy generally devote themselves to the service of the richer nobles, who, like the old feudal barons, are constantly attended by a large number of retainers. As all nobles, without any distinction, enjoy the right of voting, as well for the choice of nuncios as at the election of a king, their poverty and their number is frequently productive of great inconvenience. Hence the king, who has justly conceived a great veneration for the English constitution, wished to introduce into the new code a law similar to ours relating to county elections, that no person should be entitled to a vote in the choice of a nuncio, but those who possessed a certain qualification in land. This proposition, however, has been received with such marks of dissatisfaction that there is little probability of its ever being suffered to pass into a law. The clergy. Mieczysław, the first sovereign of Poland who embraced Christianity in the year 966, granted several immunities and estates to the clergy. His successors and the rich nobles followed his example, and the riches of this body continued increasing as well from royal as from private donations, until the Diet, apprehensive lest in process of time the greatest part of the estates should pass into the hands of the clergy, forbade by different laws, and particularly in 1669, the alienation of lands to the Church, under penalty of forfeiture, and under the present reign several estates have been confiscated which had been bestowed upon the clergy since that period. From the time of the first establishment of the Catholic religion by Cardinal Egidius, nuncio from Pope John XIII, the bishops have been admitted into the Senate as king's councillors. They were usually appointed by the king and confirmed by the Pope, but since the creation of the Permanent Council, they are nominated by His Majesty out of 3 candidates chosen by the Council. A bishop, the moment he is appointed, is of course entitled to all the privileges of a senator. The Archbishop of Nesna is primate, as we have before observed, the first senator in rank and viceroy during an interregnum. The ecclesiastics are all freemen, and, in some particular instances, have their own courts of justice in which the canon law is practiced. Of these courts of justice peculiar to the clergy, there are 3 sorts. 1. The consistorial, under the jurisdiction of each bishop in his diocese. 2. The metropolitan, under the primate, to which an appeal lies from the bishop's court. 3. That of the Pope's nuncio, which is the supreme ecclesiastical judicature within the kingdom, to which an appeal may be made both from the decision of the bishop and of the primate. In cases of divorce, dispensations for marriages, and in other instances, the parties, as in all Catholic countries, must apply to the Pope, by which means no inconsiderable sum of money is drawn out of the country by the See of Rome. In most civil affairs, the clergy are amenable to the ordinary courts of justice. In criminal causes, an ecclesiastic is first arrested by the civil powers, then judged in the consistory, and if convicted, he is remitted to the civil power, in order to undergo the penalty annexed to the crime of which he has been found guilty. One great ecclesiastical abuse, which has been abolished in most other Catholic countries, still exists in this kingdom. When the Pope sends a bull into Poland, the clergy publish and carry it into execution, without the confirmation or approbation of the civil power. Before 1538, ecclesiastics were allowed to hold civil employments, but in that year priests were declared incapable of being promoted to secular offices. They were also exempted from paying any taxes, but this exemption has been wisely taken off, and they are now rated in the same manner as the laity, with this difference, that their contributions are not called taxes, but charitable subsidies. Third, the next class of people are the burghers inhabiting towns, whose privileges were formerly far more considerable than they are at present. The history of all countries in which the feudal system has been established bears testimony to the pernicious policy of holding the lower classes of men in a state of slavish subjection. In process of time, a concurrence of causes contributed gradually to soften the rigor of this servitude with regard to the burghers in several of the feudal kingdoms. Among other circumstances tending to their protection, the most favorable was the formation of several cities into bodies politic, with the privilege of exercising municipal jurisdiction. This institution took its rise in Italy, the first country in Europe which emerged from barbarism, and was from thence transferred to France and Germany. It was first introduced into Poland about 1250, during the reign of Boleslaus the Chaste, who, being instructed in the Teutonic or German laws by Henry the Bearded Duke of Ratislau, granted first to Krakow, and afterwards to several other towns, the privileges possessed by the German cities. This body of rights is called in the statutes of Poland Jus Magdeburgicum et Teutonicum, and the cause assigned for its introduction is that no city could flourish and increase under the feudal laws. In the 13th and following centuries, the kings and great barons built several towns to all which they granted a charter of incorporation, conceived in the following terms: transfero hanc villam ex jure polonico in jus teutonicum. The beneficial tendency of this political regulation soon appeared, by a sudden increase of population and wealth. The burghers of some of the principal free towns acquired such a degree of importance and consideration as to give their assent to treaties and send deputies to the National Assembly. A noble was not degraded by being a burgher, and a burgher was capable of being an officer of the crown. High treaty which Casimir the Great entered into with the Knights of the Teutonic Order was not only signed by the king and the principal nobles, but also by the burghers of Krakow, Posen, Sandomir, and other towns, and under the same monarch, Wienesk, burgomaster of Krakow, was submarshal and treasurer of the crown. The burghers enjoyed the privileges just mentioned during the Jagiellon line, as appears from the different acts of Sigismund I and his son Sigismund Augustus. During the reign of the former, the nobles endeavored to exclude the deputies of Krakow from the Diet. But that monarch not only confirmed the right of that city to send representatives, but even decreed that the citizens were included within the class of nobles. When the crown became wholly elective, the burghers suffered continual encroachments on their privileges at every nomination of a new sovereign. They lost the right of possessing lands, excepting within a small distance of their towns, of sending deputies to the diets, and were of course excluded from all share of the legislative authority. The principal cause of this exclusion was that as the burghers were not obliged by the nature of their tenures to march against the enemy, but were only under the necessity of furnishing arms and wagons for the use of the army, they incurred the contempt of the warlike gentry, who in the true spirit of feudal arrogance considered all occupations, but that of war, as beneath a freeman and all persons not bound to military services, as unqualified for the administration of public affairs. The burghers, however, still enjoy a considerable portion of freedom and possess the following immunities. They elect their own burgomaster and council, they regulate their interior police, and have their own criminal courts of justice, which decide without appeal. A burgher, when plaintiff against a noble, is obliged to carry the cause into the courts of justice belonging to the nobles, where the judgment is final. When defendant, he must be cited before the magistrates of his own town, from whence an appeal lies only to the king, in the assessorial tribunal. To this exemption from the jurisdiction of the nobles, though only in one species of causes, the burghers owe whatever degree of independence they still retain, as without this immunity they would long ago have been reduced to a state of vassalage. The peasants in Poland, as in all feudal governments, are serfs or slaves, and the value of an estate is not estimated so much from its extent as from the number of its peasants, who are transferred from one master to another, like so many head of cattle. The peasants, however, are not all in an equal state of subjection. They are distinguished into two sorts: 1. German, 2. Natives. 1. During the reign of Boleslaus the Chaste, and more particularly in that of Casimir the Great, many Germans settled in Poland who were indulged in the use of the German laws, and their descendants still continue to enjoy several privileges not possessed by the generality of Polish peasants. The good effects of these privileges are very visible in the general state of their domestic economy. Their villages are better built, and their fields better cultivated than those which belong to the native Poles. They possess more cattle, pay their quit rents to their lords with greater exactness, and when compared with the others, are cleaner and neater in their persons. 2. The slavery of the Polish peasants is very ancient, and was always extremely rigorous. Until the time of Casimir the Great, the lord could put his peasant to death with impunity, and when the latter had no children, considered himself as the heir and seized all his effects. In 1347, Casimir prescribed a fine for the murder of a peasant, and enacted that in case of his decease without issue, his next heir should inherit. The same sovereign also decreed that a peasant was capable of bearing arms as a soldier, and that therefore he ought to be considered as a freeman. But these and other regulations, by which that amiable monarch endeavored to alleviate the miseries of the vassals, have proved ineffectual against the power and tyranny of the nobles, and have been either abrogated or eluded. That law which gives the property of a peasant dying without issue to the next of kin was instantly rendered nugatory by an old Polish maxim, that no slave can carry on any process against his master, and even the fine for his murder was seldom levied, on account of the numerous difficulties which attend the conviction of a noble for this or any other enormity. So far indeed from being inclined to soften the servitude of their vassals, the nobles have ascertained and established it by repeated and positive ordinances. An able Polish writer, in a benevolent treatise addressed to the Chancellor Zamoyski, observes that in the statutes of Poland there are above 100 laws unfavourable to the peasants, which, among other grievances, erect summary tribunals subject to no appeals, and impose the severest penalties upon those who quit their villages without leave. From these numerous and rigorous edicts, to prevent the elopement of the peasants, the same humane author justly infers the extreme wretchedness of this oppressed class of men, who cannot be detained in the place of their nativity, but by the terror of the severest punishment. The native peasants may be divided into two sorts: one, peasants of the crown; two, peasants belonging to individuals. 1. Peasants of the crown are those who are settled in the great fiefs of the kingdom or in the royal domain, and are under the jurisdictions of the starosts. If the crown peasants are oppressed by these judges, they may lodge a complaint in the royal courts of justice, and should the starost endeavour to obstruct the process, the king can order the chancellor to issue a safe conduct by which he takes the injured person under his protection. And although in most cases the corrupt administration of justice and the superior influence of the starosts prevent a complainant from obtaining any effectual redress even in the king's courts, yet the very possibility of procuring relief is some check to injustice and some alleviation of distress. 2. Peasants belonging to individuals are at the absolute disposal of their master, and have scarcely any positive security, either for their properties or their lives. Until 1768, the statutes of Poland only exacted a fine from a lord who killed his slave, but in that year a decree passed, by which the murder of a peasant was a capital crime. Yet, as the law in question requires such an accumulation of evidence as is seldom to be obtained, it has more the appearance of protection than the reality. How deplorable must be the state of that country, when a law of such a nature was thought requisite to be enacted, yet is found incapable of being enforced. The generality, indeed, of the Polish nobles are not inclined either to establish or give efficacy to any regulations in favour of the peasants, whom they scarcely consider as entitled to the common rights of humanity. A few nobles, however, of benevolent hearts and enlightened understandings, have acted upon different principles and have ventured upon the expedient of giving liberty to their vassals. The event has showed this project to be no less judicious than humane, no less friendly to their own interests than to the happiness of their peasants. For it appears that in the districts in which the new arrangement has been introduced, the population of their villages is considerably increased, and the revenues of their estates augmented in a triple proportion. The first noble who granted freedom to his peasants was Zamoyski, formerly Great Chancellor, who in 1760 enfranchised 6 villages in the Palatinate of Masovia. These villages were, in 1777, visited by the author of the patriotic letters, from whom I received the following information. On inspecting the parish registers of births from year 1750 to 1760, that is, during the 10 years of slavery immediately preceding their enfranchisement, he found the number of births 434. In the first 10 years of their freedom, from 1760 to 1770, 620, and from 1770 to the beginning of 1777, 585 births. By these extracts it appeared that during the first period there were only 43 births each year. During the second period, 62 births each year. During the third period, 77 births each year. If we suppose an improvement of this sort to take place throughout the kingdom, how great would be the increase of national population? The revenues of the 6 villages since their enfranchisement have been augmented in a much greater proportion than their population. In their state of vassalage, Zamoyski was obliged, according to the custom of Poland, to build cottages and barns for his peasants, and to furnish them with seed, horses, ploughs, and every implement of agriculture. Since their attainment of liberty, they are become so easy in their circumstances as to provide themselves with all these necessaries at their own expense. and they likewise cheerfully pay an annual rent in lieu of the manual labor, which their master formerly exacted from them. By these means, the receipts of this particular estate have been nearly tripled. Upon signing the deed of enfranchisement of the 6 villages, their benevolent master intimated some apprehensions to the inhabitants, lest, encouraged by their freedom, they should fall into every species of licentiousness and commit more disorders than when they were slaves. The simplicity and good sense of their answer is remarkable. "When we had no other property," returned they, "than the stick which we hold in our hands, we were destitute of all encouragement to a right conduct, and having nothing to lose, acted on all occasions in an inconsiderate manner. But now that our houses, our lands, and our cattle are our own, the fear of forfeiting them will be a constant restraint upon our actions." The sincerity of this assertion was manifested by the event. While they were in a state of servitude, Zamoyski was occasionally obliged to pay fines for disorders committed by his peasants, who, in a state of drunkenness, would attack and sometimes kill passengers. Since their freedom, he has seldom received any complaints of this sort against them. These circumstances decisively confute the ill-grounded surmises entertained by many Poles that their vassals are too licentious and ungovernable not to make an ill use of freedom. Zamoyski, pleased with the thriving state of the 6 villages, has enfranchised the peasants on all his estates. The example of Zamoyski has been followed by Kreptowicz, Vice-Chancellor of Lithuania, and the Abbé Bryzotowski with similar success. I was informed by a person who had visited the Abbé's estate at Paulovo near Vilna that the happy countenance and comfortable air of these peasants made them appear a different race of men from the wretched tenants of the neighboring villages. The peasants, penetrated with a sense of their master's kindness, have erected at their own expense a pillar with an inscription expressive of their gratitude and affection. Prince Stanislaus, nephew to the King of Poland, has warmly patronized the plan of giving liberty to the peasants. His own good sense and natural humanity, improved during his residence in England by a view of that equal liberty which pervades every rank of men, have raised him above the prejudices too prevalent among his countrymen. He has enfranchised 4 villages not far from Warsaw, in which he has not only emancipated the peasants from their slavery, but even condescends to direct their affairs. I had the honor of holding several conversations with him upon this subject. He explained to me in the most satisfactory manner that the grant of freedom was no less advantageous to the lord than to the peasant, provided the former is willing to superintend their conduct for a few years and to put them in a way of acting for themselves. For such is the ignorance of the generality among the Boers, arising from their abject slavery, and so little have they been usually left to their own discretion that few at first are equal to the proper management of a farm. From a conviction of these facts, the prince, whose knowledge and benevolence I shall ever revere, continues his attention to their concerns. He visits their cottages, suggests improvements in agriculture, instructs them in the mode of rearing cattle and bees, and points out the errors into which ignorance and incapacity occasionally betray them. The example of this prince, great by his rank but still greater by his humanity, can scarcely fail of producing its due effect, especially as he intends giving to the public a particular account of his arrangements and regulations, and will show how much he has increased the value of his estate as well as the happiness of his peasants. Still, the condition of these peasants is not permanent, for though a lord grants their freedom, yet he cannot entail it upon them, as his successor may again reduce them to their original state of vassalage. It is, however, in agitation to secure the perpetuity of their liberty when they are once rendered free. But this measure is of so delicate a nature that it must be introduced with great caution, and can only be the gradual work of time. v. In giving an account of the different classes of men who inhabit this country, the Jews form too considerable a part of its present inhabitants not to be particularly mentioned. This people date their introduction into Poland about the time of Casimir the Great, and as they enjoy privileges which they scarcely possess in any other country excepting England and Holland, their numbers have surprisingly increased. Lengnich, whom I have often quoted, says of them that they monopolize the commerce and trade of the country, keep the inns and taverns, are stewards to the nobility, and seem to have so much influence that nothing can be bought or sold without the intervention of a Jew. Under John Sobieski, they were so highly favored that his administration was invidiously called a Jewish junto. He farmed to the Jews the royal domain and put such confidence in them as raised great discontents among the nobility. After his death, an ancient law of Sigismund of France was revived and inserted in the Pacta Conventa of Augustus II, that no Jew or person of low birth should be capable of farming the royal revenues. In some towns, as at Casimir, Posen, etc., the Jews are permitted to settle, but in other places they are only allowed to reside during the time of fairs or when the dietines are assembled. But the laws are seldom put in force against them. I endeavored to obtain a probable account of their number, but I found this to be no easy matter, although all Jews, as well male as female, pay an annual poll tax and therefore must be registered. According to the last capitation, there were 166,871 Jews in Poland, exclusive of Lithuania, who paid that tax. But this cannot be their full complement, as it is their interest to diminish their number, and it is a well-known fact that they conceal their children as much as possible. Perhaps the following calculations will assist us in this research. Of 2,580,796 inhabitants in Austrian Poland, 144,200, or about an 18th, were Jews. The 18th of the present population of Poland will give near 500,000, allowing therefore for omissions in the capitation, as well as for those who migrated into Poland from the Russian dismembered province. The number of Jews may fairly be estimated at 600,000. Before the late partition, Poland contained about 14 million inhabitants. As far as I could collect from various conversations with several intelligent Poles, its present population amounts to 9 million. It is not unworthy of observation that while the feudal laws, formerly so universal, and of which some traces are still to be discovered in most countries, have been gradually abolished in other nations and given place to a more regular and just administration, yet in Poland a variety of circumstances has concurred to prevent their abolition, and to preserve that mixture of liberty and oppression, order and anarchy, which so strongly characterized the feudal government. We may easily trace in this constitution all the striking features of that system. The principal are an elective monarchy with a circumscribed power, the great officers of state possessing their charges for life and independent of the king's authority, royal fiefs, the great nobility above control, the nobles or gentry alone free and possessing lands, feudal tenures, military services, territorial jurisdiction, commerce degrading, oppressed condition of the burghers, vassalage of the peasants. In the course of this book, I have had occasion to make mention of most of these evils as still existing in Poland, and they may be considered as the radical causes of its decline, for they have prevented the Poles from adopting those more stable regulations which tend to introduce order and good government, to augment commerce and to increase population,